Okay, so we're starting a new series, and I wanted to give you a bit of an introduction to this because it's a bit of an odd series. So I'll give you kind of a roadmap of where we're going to and how we're going to get there. We're going to start out with some history. The first lesson is going to be two parts, and we're going to look at what the end of the Old Testament, what happens there and what happens after that. So we're going to look at the last books of Bible. We're going to particularly focus on Malachi there. And then after we've spent a good bit of time on Malachi and what's going on with Israel at that time, then we'll look at the intertestamental period, and that's the period that comes after the Old Testament and before the New Testament. And we'll go through that, and we're going to be looking for a bunch of different things in there, and I'll explain that in a bit. So, and then we're going to go on to another lesson that's going to have a different name. It's going to be kind of unrelated, but it really isn't unrelated. As you'll see once we go through that, you'll see that there's an awful lot of commonality between this one and that one. And so it's really part of a series that's linked together. So the focus, well, there's multiple focuses here. This is, you could call it unfocused, really. There are going to be a lot of different things that we're going to be looking at. One of them, one of the big ones is the spiritual decay of Israel, and we're going to see that beginning in Malachi and through that whole intertestamental period. And we're going to see how they came back from Babylon and tried to get good with God again. But then by the time we see them in the New Testament, we see them as people who are faithless, people who are unloving, unforgiving, rigidly applying the law, a lot of faults like that that Jesus criticizes them for. And so we're going to see how that came to be. Surprisingly enough, we're going to deal with Elijah a little bit in there because Malachi refers to Elijah. And another big part of this that we're going to look at is world governments over time and how God looks at them. And that's going to be a theme throughout everything. And we'll also look a little bit at the last world government, the Antichrist, and how close we are to that. And that's going to be done through the Daniel prophecy section that we're going to be looking at as well. So that's where we're going to. We're going to have all of those kind of themes flowing along as we go through. And I'm going to start with a little bit of an addition to Pastor Joe's last sermon. Not that he said anything wrong, just that the Bible looks at things just a little bit differently. He was talking about a one world government, which we sometimes call the New World Order. The Bible doesn't use words like that. Those are human names and descriptions of what we're expecting. The Bible has a different view on late human history, and it sees them as a series of world governments. Each one of them was a one world government, if you want to look at it that way. And that series we're going to see the Bible describes as getting worse over time. Each one is worse than the previous one. And that is going to make sense that they were world governments because of God's different definition than ours. When we think of a one world government, we think that they rule the entire surface of the earth. God's definition is a little different than that. His rule is that these world governments ruled all of the world that matters at that period in time. And matters, you might ask, matters to who? Well, it matters to God. What matters to God about these kings of kings that were aspiring to conquer every other kingdom in the world? And so we're going to cover things like that and learn how God sees things differently. And so Pastor Joe's message was really about the very end of that series of world governments. And so we think of that particular one as being the one world government. And so that, as I mentioned before in the introduction, this world government over time is going to be a theme that we're going to see coming through all of these lessons. And so we're starting a series that's going to look at all of this. The Bible does give us some details about that final world kingdom. And it talks about them being made of 10 divisions. So the whole world at that time, or at least the world that matters at that time, according to God, is going to be broken up into 10 divisions. And each one of these divisions will have its own king. And if you look carefully at what the Bible says, it says that not all of these divisions, or not all of these kings will agree on everything all of the time. And that's really not a special statement. Whenever you have people ruling a kingdom, they're going to have different views on how things are going to be done. So they're going to have some differences sometimes. And we see that in the Bible, there are going to be differences among these people. So once the one world government has broken into these 10 divisions, that is kind of the very last stage of time. The Antichrist comes on the scene at that time, and he gains power through a series of events and things that he does. And he's going to convince 3 of those 10 divisions to give their authority to him. And ultimately, he becomes a very strong influence over the whole organization and kind of rules it without being a real king of all of it. But one of the things that he's going to do is he's going to conquer Jerusalem and proclaim himself to be greater than God. And that's going to be special to what we're going to be looking at through here, because in that time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, um, the intertestamental period that I talked about, there's another person who is a type of the Antichrist who does that same thing. He proclaims himself to be greater than God or God himself, and he does a bunch of things that the Bible talks about the final Antichrist doing. So he's a type and therefore kind of a pattern or something very similar to what the final one will be. And we're going to see that come up as we deal with all of these verses. So once the Antichrist has come on the scene and gained power, then the false Messiah comes on the scene, and he becomes the second in command to the Antichrist. And he is the one who will create and enforce that mark of the beast that we studied just a little while ago. So that gives you kind of a quick run through the end times of history. And we'll get back to pieces of this as we go through this study. Okay, so this is really the beginning of today's lesson. We're closing the Old Testament. We're looking at the last few books, especially Malachi, which is the last book. And we're going to look at that intertestamental period after that. Today we'll probably mostly look at Malachi. I don't think we're going to get beyond that. It'll be next week, I expect, that we get to the intertestamental period. But there's lots of things to cover in all of these, lots of good things to cover. So as the biblical Old Testament, the books of the Old Testament come to a close, Israel, which is mostly the southern tribes at that time. Remember, the northern tribes were captured by the Assyrians and taken away, and we don't hear from them ever again. But the southern tribes, which is Judah and Benjamin, were the ones that were taken by the Babylonians. And so now they've returned from what's called that Babylonian captivity. But of course, by the time they return, they're not under the Babylonians anymore. They're under the Medo-Persians. But anyway, they've returned to the land from that Babylonian captivity, and they need to rebuild, both physically and spiritually. Everything was torn down in the battle that conquered Jerusalem, and so it's a great big rubble pile, and they have to rebuild houses and homes and walls and all of that stuff. And they're struggling with that, but they also need to rebuild spiritually, and they're really struggling with that. We're going to see all sorts of references by these authors of these books that are telling them that you're really not following God. You've kind of ignored God. And so the books that are kind of the last end of the Bible here are the books of Ezra, who was the priest, Nehemiah, who was a governor over them, and Haggai and Zechariah, which were the prophets. And Malachi is a bit confusing. I'll get into that later. Was he a prophet or was he something different? We're not exactly sure what he was, but I will talk about that in a minute. So after these books of the Bible come to a close, and Malachi being the last one in the Bible, in the Old Testament, there's a 350-year gap, and that's that intertestamental period that I've been talking about. So for 350 years, there are no books of the Bible written during that time. But a whole lot of very important things happened during that time. Prophetic things happened at that time. And so I want us to go through that and understand that. And we'll link all of this together. So the most time today that we're going to spend is going to be on Malachi and things related to what Malachi said. So when the Torah is read to the returned Israelites, okay, so they've just come back from Babylonian captivity. They're starting to rebuild. Nehemiah makes sure that the Torah is read to them on a particular day. They are repentant on that day. They realize that their ancestors had sinned against God, and God was entirely just in sending them off to Babylon and destroying Jerusalem. And they are repentant at that time. They really want to be God's people again. And they make real efforts to do that. They make real changes. They've done some things wrong and they correct those things. But we're going to see that they keep falling off the path. They just don't seem to have what it takes to stay God's people. We see them with Nehemiah. They stop bringing offerings to the temple because they just don't want to do that anymore. They stop keeping the Sabbath. They allow the temple to become unclean. People are allowed in there who shouldn't have been allowed in there. They treat each other badly for a bunch of reasons. And because of all these things, God starts sending prophets to warn them. And that's just like things were before they were taken off to Babylon. So they really haven't made any advancements. The whole Babylon experience hasn't brought them closer to God. It has left them the same people that they ever were. They're right back where they were before Babylon. And that's kind of a sad thing to see, but it is a characteristic of humans all the time. So Haggai actually makes a comment that is kind of a good summary of that, and it's a good starting point for us in looking at how the Jews started after this Babylonian exile return, and the problem that they had there, and then we're going to see as we go through Malachi that things are not getting better; they're getting worse over time, and we'll see that through the intertestamental period as well. So the returnees are not flourishing. They are struggling with both the physical and the spiritual, as I said. And so Haggai calls the people to step back and see what is going on. Look at the troubles you're having. Why is this happening? And so the verses from Haggai 1, 5, and 6 are, Now then the Lord of armies says this, Consider your ways. You have sown much, but only to harvest little. You eat, but there is not enough to be satisfied. You drink, but there is not enough to become drunk. He isn't advocating becoming drunk. He says that if you wanted to be drunk, you wouldn't have enough to drink to be able to do that. So you put on clothing, but there is not enough for anyone to get warm. And the one who earns wages to put into a money bag full of holes. And so it's lost. So Haggai's point here is, consider your ways. Why do you think these things are happening to you? Why are you never successful? Why is everything going wrong? Why do you always have less than you expected? And Haggai's point, of course, is God is trying to get your attention. He wants you to consider him. You've started focusing your lives on your reconstruction of your homes, but you've forgotten all about God. And that really is the key point that we're going to see here in the downward transformation of Israel, is that as much as they want to be returned to God and be God's people again, they just don't focus on God. And we know if you lose your focus on God, it isn't long until you're just going to be dragged away by the world. And that's exactly that. The cares of the world, building their homes, reestablishing society, all those sort of things are more important to them than God. And that's really the key to their problem. So they're missing the signs that God has been sending them. So instead of doing what they should do, paying attention to God, they try to work harder to make up for the wages that get lost and all of the things that don't work for them. But still, things just don't succeed for them. And so Haggai is saying, look at this, consider your ways. God is trying to talk to you. So going next to Malachi, and Malachi continues on with warnings, but by the time Malachi is a little bit later. He comes afterwards. He probably lives at the same time as Nehemiah, but late in the Nehemiah period, people believe. But none of those people, Nehemiah, Ezra, none of them mention this Malachi. And so we're going to see him say, or looking at Israel a little bit further down the line, but not very much, only like 20 or 30 years. So what Malachi starts to warn them about is that they're starting to show contempt for the altar. By this time, they had built up the temple again, at least somewhat to where it was, and sacrifices have started, but they're showing contempt for the altar, is what Malachi says. They're doing things like bringing blind or sick or lame animals to sacrifice them to God. And another thing that, and we know that one's wrong, that's plainly wrong. You're supposed to bring your very best to sacrifice to God. And another thing that they've been doing is, Malachi says, you drown the altar with tears, weeping and wailing because God no longer accepts your offerings. Well, if your offerings were good, then you wouldn't have to be drowning the altar in tears. And so what you're doing there is you want God to accept less than you should be giving him. And that's wrong too. So that's that bad attitude that the Israelites are showing towards God. People are also mistreating each other, he says. They're breaking promises to each other. They've defiled the temple with the things that they've done. Men have married women who worship foreign gods. That shouldn't be happening. The people are giving less than the full amount of their tithes. Men are divorcing their wives. All of these things Malachi is saying, look at what you're doing. All of these things aren't acceptable. We read the Torah to you, you understood it, and you wanted to follow it, but here you are not following it. So Malachi continues on. It's a long list of grievances that God has against the Israelites that he's delivering through Malachi. And the people are saying things like, the Lord Almighty thinks all evildoers are good. In fact, he likes them. Now that's something that we commonly see today, is that God loves everyone. He loves the evildoers, he loves the good doers. In fact, he likes all of them. And that's a wrong statement. Pastor Joe preached a sermon on that. And another thing that the people are saying about God is, where is the God who is supposed to be just? And so they're saying, there's injustices in our lives. Why isn't God stepping in to correct these injustices? Well, God doesn't always work that way, but nonetheless, they expect somehow that God is going to enforce justice, and He doesn't do that. He wants us to be just. Another thing that they say about God is that it's useless to serve God. Proud people are the ones who are happy in life. Evil people not only prosper, but they test God's patience with their evil deeds and they get away with it. So they're saying there's no point in serving God. Why would we do that? The people who don't serve God are happier, they have better lives, they're prosperous, they do all the things that are better than us. And God responds to that one specifically. He says, I'm going to act, and on the day that I act, I will be merciful to the ones who fear me, as parents are merciful to the children who serve them. So he's saying there's a day coming when I'm going to correct all of these things, and the people who are my people, the ones who fear me, are the ones who are going to see my mercy then. The others are not going to see my mercy. And Malachi 1:11 through 12 talks about that, and it kind of summarizes that. He says, for from the rising of the sun even to its setting, my name shall be great among the nations, and in every place frankincense is going to be offered to my name, and a grain offering that is pure. For my name shall be great among the nations, says the Lord of armies, but you are profaning it. So he says, in the future, and we talked about this before in another lesson, after the second coming, people are going to be doing what they should. They're going to be living the way they should be living because Jesus is on earth. And he says, and so those people is what he's saying, those people are going to do it right, but here you are, you're supposed to be my people now, but you're profaning it. You're saying horrible things about me, profaning the temple, doing everything wrong. So in Malachi, we see a lot of grievances, a lot of warnings coming from Malachi about the things that they're doing wrong. And so far we've just talked about the general people. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what Malachi has to say to the priests. The priests are also showing contempt for the altar by the things that they do. They offer food that they despise, or leftovers that they're tired of, is what it refers to. So they're kind of treating God like, give it to Mikey, he'll eat anything. He doesn't care. But of course, God does care. God wants your best. He wants you to give him your best all of the time, and that's true of us as well. So another thing that they do is they offer stolen animals or sick animals or lame animals. And they allow the lame animals and sick animals that the people bring to also be served on the altar. And they're supposed to be the gatekeepers for that. They're supposed to make sure that the people are doing the right thing, but they're allowing people to do the wrong thing. So the priests have a bunch of grievances against them as well. And so they've turned away from the right path as well. And they're turning other people's away too. Their teachings are wrong. Their teachings have led people to do wrong things because they're being taught the wrong thing. And one thing Malachi says specifically, he says, when they teach, they do not treat everyone alike. They teach that some people are different to God, and their relationship to God is different because they're wealthy or because they're in a position of power or something like that. So they're treating people as though God does respect persons, but as the pastor just said a minute ago, God does not respect persons. And so these false teachings are causing the people to do wrong things. And Malachi also says God is already punishing them for what they are doing. And we saw that also with the other verses that said that God is causing your successes to become not successes. The things that you should have, you don't get. And so again, Malachi is saying that they're not doing what they should be doing, and what's happening is that they're suffering for it. So Malachi doesn't just warn them, he also talks about the future a little bit. And you would think with Malachi being the end of the Old Testament that he would be talking about the first coming, about Jesus' time and what's going to happen there. But the prophecies that he used are all about the second coming, not the first coming. So that's kind of a curious thing. You wouldn't expect that. But one of the things that he says here from Malachi 3 is, behold, I am sending my messenger, and he will clear a way before me, and the Lord whom you are seeking will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of armies. But who can endure the day of his coming, and who can stand when he appears? So when you look at that carefully, there are people who misunderstand that and think that that's talking about Jesus' time, but it really isn't, because it uses words like sudden coming and day of appearing. And those are all indications of the second coming. The first coming, Jesus comes as a baby, not as a conqueror, not as anything like that. And so we're talking about a very different person. So this is a second coming, not a first coming description. But he does talk about things that are going to happen there. And he continues on with that by saying, for he is like a refiner's fire and like launderer's soap, and he will sit as a smelter and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi. And we know that Jesus didn't do that. And he will refine them like gold and silver, so that they may present to the Lord offerings in righteousness. And we know that they didn't do that either. Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord, as in the days of old and as in former years. So again, second coming references are all through this. It talks about believers being purified and the priests doing what they should do. And so again, we see offerings made at the temple after the second coming. And I know we did a lesson on that, but I'll just mention that for a moment here, is that's what he's talking about. He's talking about that future temple, Ezekiel's temple, is what we're talking about, those sacrifices that are going on there. And he's saying that at that time, the priests will do what they should do, and the people will do what they should do, and everything will be in order. And the reason for that, we know, it doesn't say it here, but we know that the reason is that Jesus is on earth making sure that people do these things. So Malachi continues to talk. Malachi actually has quite a bit of prophecy in it. I haven't brought all of it here for you, just selected bits of it. But he's continuing on with these verses that we started with 2 slides back. So he says, then I will come near to you for judgment, and I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, the adulterers, against those who swear falsely, those who oppress the wage earner in his wages, or the widow or the orphan, and those who turn away the stranger from justice, and do not fear me, says the Lord of armies. So this is continuing on. He's been talking about the temple period, the millennial period, and now he's talking about the judgment day that comes after that. And he says, at that time, I will judge all of these people who have done wrong. People who don't fear me is really the key to this. In fact, this statement, people who fear me, we know already that he's not talking about being afraid. He's talking about respect, that kind of a fear. And so he uses those words repeatedly in Malachi. And Malachi is a short book. It only has 4 or 5 chapters. But in there's like 4 or maybe 5 references to people who fear me or people who do not fear me. And that's kind of a key to Malachi. And so what he's saying here is when the judgment comes, it's the people who fear me who will receive my mercy. But the people who don't fear me and do all of these evil things that he's listed here, those are the people that are in trouble and under judgment. Okay, he says more things about the future here. This skips to Malachi chapter 4. And he says, behold, I'm going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. He will turn the hearts of the fathers back to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, so that I will not come and strike the land with complete destruction. Okay, lots of people have trouble with this. The first thing is the great and terrible day of the Lord. That's talking about the second coming, because that will be a great day for some people, but a terrible day for others. And when we did those studies before the temple period and also about other books, we saw that when Jesus comes, those people who are not fearing God suddenly have a real new attitude change. It's a terrible day for them. They realize how wrong they've been, how their lives have not been anything close to what God would want them to live. And so for them, it's a terrible day, and they suddenly find themselves having to get right with God. And they do. That happens, and we see them a little bit later on as people who are happy to be going up to the Temple Mount to learn about God and learn his ways. So for them, it was a terrible day when he came. But of course, for us, for those who are believers, those who fear God, it would be a great day for us because he is what we've been expecting all along. He is the Messiah we've been waiting for. So a great day for some and a terrible day for others. Now, another thing that it talks about there is fathers. It says he will turn the hearts of the fathers back to their children and the children to their fathers. Now, we ask ourselves, do the fathers not love their children at this time that Malachi is talking about? Do children not love their fathers? What is this? And the real key to understanding this is the translation could probably be better here. The word that's being used for fathers is most of the time used in the Bible in the singular form as father. So he's really not talking about people and their fathers. He's talking about Father God is what this should be rendered as. And we'll see that in the New Testament, which refers back to Malachi in this verse, and Jesus straightens that out. So what it says is he will turn the hearts of God back to the children and he will turn the hearts of the children back to God, is what he's meant. And that makes more sense, because this really isn't the problem with fathers not loving their children and children not loving their fathers. It's talking about God and the relationship with people and people in their relationship with God. And he says that when I do this on the great and terrible day of the Lord, it needs to be done, or else I would come and strike the land with complete destruction, and there would be nothing left. So some people think that this Elijah that's being referred to is John the Baptist only, but this is another one of those cases that I've talked about so many times, when there's a type fulfillment of a prophecy that's going to have a later complete fulfillment. And so Elijah is John the Baptist in a sense, and Jesus says, if you think about it the right way, yeah, he is John the Baptist. But there's another one coming at the second coming who will also be a person who leads into that, being that same role that John the Baptist had. So John was a type fulfillment. That's what we say. He was a person in that same pattern. If you think of that description of what he's going to do being a pattern, then Elijah fits into that, and also John the Baptist fits into that. So Elijah is still to come in our time, looking forward from our time. And the only question we really have is, will it be the real Elijah? Because John the Baptist wasn't the real Elijah. He was a person who was the same in certain ways. And we'll see the verses from the New Testament that talk about that. So that's the only real question. Is it the real Elijah, or is it someone who is also in the pattern of Elijah? Could be either way. So we'll look at Elijah a little bit here because of this reference in Malachi. And I've brought verses from the New Testament that talk about John the Baptist being Elijah. And so this first one comes from Matthew 11:10-15. And it says, from the days of Johanan, that's John the Baptizer, until this hour, the kingdom of heaven is led by force, and the violent are seizing it. All the prophets and the law, the Torah, have prophesied until John. And if you will, he is Elijah, who was to come. Whoever has an ear to hear, let him hear. So this is Jesus speaking this. He says, if you will, if you think about it the right way, he is the Elijah who was to come. And so that whoever has an ear to hear, let him hear, means think about this. You need to think about this a little bit to understand it. It's not so simple. So the next set of verses comes from Luke 1. And in this case, this is an angel speaking to Zechariah, who is going to be the father of John the Baptist. And the angel is going to be quoting Malachi. And he says, and he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord Yahweh. Now see, there's that reference that we talked about from Malachi. He's not talking about the children to their physical fathers. He's talking about the children of Israel to their spiritual father, their God, he says. And he will go before him in the spirit. Now he, John, will go before him in the spirit and in the power of Elijah, the prophet, to turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and those who do not have faith to the knowledge of the just one. And he will prepare a perfect people for the Lord Yahweh. So what's being said there is that this John the Baptist is going to be like Elijah in the sense that he's going to be Elijah in the spirit and power of Elijah. So he's not the physical Elijah. He is has that same spirit that Elijah has. He has that same power that Elijah had. But he has the similar mission of turning the heart of the fathers to the children. And that's what his job is when he comes, or did come from our viewpoint. So more about Elijah in this sense of Elijah being John the Baptist. And again, this is Jesus speaking, or will speak. And his disciples asked him, and they were saying to him, why do the scribes therefore say that Elijah must come first? Yeshua answered, and he said to them, Elijah does come first, so that everything may end. But I say to you, behold, Elijah has come, and they have done unto him everything whatsoever they wished. They were cruel to him. Likewise also the Son of Man is going to suffer from them. Then the disciples understood that he spoke to them about John the Baptizer. So when Jesus says Elijah does come first so that everything may end means second coming, because it certainly didn't end with the first coming. And he says, but I say to you, again, think about it, behold, Elijah has come. And they did everything to him, and now his disciples understood that John the Baptist was that Elijah for their time. So that's how Elijah fits into Malachi. So this is going to be a shorter lesson than I expected, but maybe I will go on just a little bit into the next part. So summarizing a little bit here, given a short time, we see the Jews would stop following God. They came back to to their promised land, and were starting to build it up, and they wanted to be followers of God, but they just couldn't stay on that track. We saw that they were getting pretty bad in Malachi's time. Many years later, 350 years later, we see that they really have become bad by the time Jesus comes. Nehemiah tried to force them to do what God wanted them to do. He would actually lock the doors of, or the gates of the Jerusalem so that people couldn't engage in commerce and bring things in for sale. And he was trying to force them to do that. There was one man that he grabbed by the beard and hauled him around to try to get him to do what was right. And so Nehemiah was trying to get them to look at themselves through force and change, but that didn't succeed. And now God, through Malachi, is trying to convict them, trying to say, look at the things you're doing. You don't realize it, perhaps, but the things that you're doing, you are mistreating God in all sorts of ways. And that didn't succeed either. He couldn't convict them to change themselves either. And so we see that their time in Babylon really hadn't made any severe changes to them. They were still much the same people who had been dragged off to Babylon captivity. And that's kind of a surprise, because you would think you would learn something from that. It was all prophesied that that was going to happen. The time that they were going to be there was prophesied as being 70 years, and sure enough, these people have come back after 70 years. Some of them are still alive, who are people who were alive at the time that Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians. And you would think that they could learn from all of that, but they just haven't been able to do that. Major failing on them. So now we're going to look a little bit at the world governments that I was talking about and this progression for Israel. And so we're going to talk first about the Babylonian exile and that period of time. That started in 587 BC. Remember, numbers go backwards when you're in BC. So 587 comes earlier in time than 539 BC. So the Babylonian kingdom, empire, was in charge for 48 years of Israel's time. And Malachi is writing after the end of the Babylonian Empire, and in fact after the end of the Medo-Persian Empire. So the Babylonian Empire had been a one world power. They had been the greatest world empire of up to that time. There hadn't been any others that were world empires as God sees them. And but the world was a smaller place back then, and also, as I mentioned before, God counts these things differently. And essentially, as I said before, they were an empire of everything that mattered in God's view. Now, it was a much smaller empire than the later empires. We'll see with the Greek and the Roman. The Roman was a huge empire, that those were much larger. But from God's perspective, they were all one world empires. And what we're also going to see, not only that they were larger, but they were worse. And much later on, we're going to see that. So the Jews spent 70 years in Babylon, those 48 years under Babylonian rule, and then the rest of that 70 years under Medo-Persian rule. That's how they spent that period of time. But I am going to cut it off here, and we'll pick that up. We'll start looking at the Medo-Persian period of time, and then we'll start looking into the intertestamental period some more. So that'll be it for this week.